After a full day of marching, a Roman soldier could reach the place where he was supposed to rest and discover that the hardest work was not over. Before he could eat or sleep, the army had to turn open ground into a defended camp. Positions had to be marked, streets laid out, baggage controlled, tents raised, defenses built, guards assigned. In the kind of republican camp described by the Greek historian Polybius, the tents stood roughly 200 Roman feet back from the defensive perimeter. That empty ground was not wasted space. It helped troops move, gave room for animals and captured property, and reduced the danger of fire and missiles reaching the tents during a night attack. Thousands of exhausted men had to manufacture order before darkness could exploit them. Rome did not treat the camp as a pause between battles. It treated the camp as part of survival. If the routine failed, exhaustion could become panic. If it worked, an army that had marched all day could still defend itself before dawn. The Roman camp was not where the war machine stopped. It was where the war machine rebuilt itself. By the time the column halted, the soldiers had already done what most modern people would consider a full day's work. They had marched under armor, carried weapons and equipment, swallowed dust, crossed bad ground, and kept pace with thousands of other men, pack animals, horses, and wagons. Feet were sore, shoulders ached beneath straps. Water containers were lighter than they had been that morning. Then came the order to stop. For the Roman soldier, that did not necessarily mean rest. It meant another shift of work. Before the army could safely close its eyes, it needed a place where sleeping would not become a death sentence. Men had to move into their assigned areas. Baggage had to be controlled. Animals needed space. Tents had to go up. Defensive work had to be completed. Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BC, considered this Roman willingness to perform the exhausting work of entrenchment one of the significant features of their camp system. The Romans accepted additional labor because they wanted the basic organization of their camp to remain familiar. For an army operating far from home, that mattered most at precisely the moment when men were least capable of improvising. Imagine several thousand exhausted soldiers simply dropping wherever they pleased. Fires appear between sleeping places. Pack animals wander through narrow gaps. Weapons disappear beneath blankets and baggage. Men searching for food collide with men searching for water. Then someone shouts that an enemy has been seen in the darkness. Men wake without knowing which direction to move. One frightened horse breaks loose, another follows. A blocked passage becomes a crush. Darkness turns inconvenience into danger. The Roman answer was to impose geometry on exhaustion. In Polybius's description, the tents were separated from the defensive earthwork by an open interval roughly 200 Roman feet deep. At first, that seems wasteful. Why leave so much empty ground inside a camp already containing thousands of men? Because the empty ground was doing several jobs at once. Troops could move through it without every unit being forced between tent lines. Animals and captured property could be held there. If an attacker threw firebrands or missiles over the outer defenses, the distance helped keep them away from the tents. The empty space was not empty. It was a safety system. But someone still had to create it. A legionary who wanted food could first find himself carrying equipment. A man desperate to lie down could instead be moving earth or helping with the perimeter. Officers and centurions needed the work completed before darkness reduced visibility and increased the danger of surprise. If that work failed, the consequence was not an untidy campsite. Thousands of sleeping men could be thrown into confusion at the precise moment they most needed order. This was the bargain at the heart of Roman camp life. The army took energy from men who had little left and spent it on security. Polybius even contrasted Roman practice with Greek armies that depended more heavily on the natural protection of the terrain. The Romans were prepared to accept the fatigue of defensive labor in return for a camp whose basic arrangement was familiar to the force. So when a Roman column finally stopped moving, the battlefield did not disappear. It changed shape. The sword might return to its scabbard. The shield might come off the arm. But now tools came out. The ground had to be measured. And before most soldiers even reached the campsite, a smaller group had already begun. Polybius describes a tribune and specially assigned centurions moving ahead of the main army to survey the ground. Their first problem was orientation. Where would the commander be? Which direction would become the front? Where would the legions begin? Once those decisions were made, measurement followed. The space for the praetorium, the commander's headquarters, was established first. Then came the line for the tents of the tribunes and the reference points from which the troop quarters would extend. These were not arbitrary decisions reinvented every evening. The measurements were familiar. That changed everything. A white flag could identify the consul's position. Crimson flags marked other important points. Spears and additional markers helped indicate lines and streets. By the time the main column approached, the apparently empty field already had a skeleton. There were no stone buildings, no permanent towers, no paved avenues, just flags, spears, measurements, and men who knew what those objects meant. Now, imagine the marching column coming into view. Thousands of men do not have to stand waiting while officers decide where each unit should sleep. A soldier can see a reference marker. He knows the relationship between that point and his unit. He begins moving toward the place where he belongs. Polybius found this familiarity remarkable enough to compare soldiers entering the Roman camp with people returning to their native city. Once inside, a man knew his quarter and where his own place should be. That comparison reveals what the camp really was. It was not simply a collection of tents, it was remembered geography. In the layout Polybius describes, the tribunes occupied their own line. Behind them was room for horses, mules, and baggage. A space of 100 Roman feet separated the front of their area from the beginning of the legionary quarters. Within the troop areas, streets approximately 50 feet wide divided units facing one another. Another passage crossed the camp at right angles. Because of its position beside the 5th companies and troops, it was known as the Quintana. To an outsider, those measurements might look like obsessive military bureaucracy. To an exhausted soldier, they meant something far simpler. He did not need a completely new map every night. That mattered because establishing camp was a race against disorder. Baggage was arriving, animals needed to be secured, men needed food. Defensive work still had to be completed. Light was disappearing. If thousands of soldiers had to negotiate their positions from scratch every evening, the camp itself could become a traffic jam of men, tents, weapons, animals, and supplies. Standardization removed decisions. The first defense was not earth. It was predictability. That does not mean every Roman camp across centuries of history was an identical square stamped mechanically onto the landscape. Terrain, army size, period, and circumstances all mattered. Polybius was describing a particular republican military system and its ideal organization, but the principle was powerful. Keep important relationships familiar. Keep units in expected positions. Make the ground legible before fatigue turns small confusion into large confusion. The transformation could be dramatic. Hours earlier, there had been nothing but open terrain. Then officers arrived. A white flag entered the earth. Other markers followed. Invisible lines became streets. Streets became blocks. Blocks filled with soldiers, horses, baggage, equipment, and tents. Before darkness fully arrived, an army far from Rome had begun constructing something that looked less like a temporary campsite than a military town. The walls mattered, but first, everyone had to know their address. Once the camp had a shape, the work became personal. A Roman army did not become orderly because every soldier suddenly felt disciplined. It became orderly because duties were assigned, divided, supervised, repeated, and checked. Polybius describes the ground in front of the tribunes' tents being treated almost like a public square. Because soldiers gathered there during the day, men were assigned to keep it swept and watered. Other units rotated through service for individual tribunes. When their turn came, they could be responsible for pitching an officer's tent, leveling the surrounding ground, protecting his baggage, and supplying guards. Even comfort had a labor bill. Behind the officers' tents stood horses, mules, and baggage. Those animals created another problem. A tethered horse could injure itself. A loose horse could crash into neighboring animals and turn an orderly camp into confusion without a single enemy appearing. Polybius describes guards being assigned around the cavalry areas, with attention paid to preventing horses from tangling their tethers or breaking loose. The detail matters because a Roman camp was full of things that could go wrong without anyone crossing the ditch. A broken tether, a frightened animal, a blocked street, baggage left where soldiers needed to move, a tent placed badly, an unfinished piece of defensive work. And Rome's answer was not to assume that everyone would behave perfectly. It divided responsibility. The same logic reached the perimeter. Polybius describes the entrenchment and stockade being divided into sections. Different bodies of troops were responsible for different parts. Centurions supervised individual sections. Tribunes exercised broader oversight. So picture the camp at ground level near the end of the day. One group is shifting earth. Another is working with stakes. Men are raising tents. Others guard baggage. Someone watches horses pulling against their ropes. Equipment is being placed where it can be found again. Men are preparing food. Officers move through the activity, checking whether the work has actually been completed. If one part of that chain failed, the problem might not remain local. A loose animal could obstruct a street. Unprotected baggage could disappear. An unfinished defensive section could leave sleeping men dependent on a gap someone was supposed to close. The camp gave soldiers security by taking away part of their rest. That was the bargain. The system also distributed these burdens, rather than placing every additional duty on the same men every night. Polybius describes units rotating through service to tribunes so that responsibilities returned at intervals. This did not make camp life comfortable. It made discomfort organized, and hierarchy was visible everywhere. An ordinary soldier might spend part of the evening leveling another man's ground or guarding another man's property before attending to his own meal. The consul and tribunes occupied privileged spaces, their baggage received protection, their positions formed part of the architecture of command. Military hierarchy did not disappear when the battle formation dissolved. It became geography. But the same hierarchy also created accountability. Centurions supervised men. Tribunes supervised larger portions of the system. Orders moved downward, reports moved upward. Nothing about this arrangement depended on thousands of soldiers behaving like heroes every evening. That was the point. Rome did not need exhausted men to improvise excellence after every march. It needed them to perform familiar jobs in familiar places under men whose responsibilities were also defined. By nightfall, the camp was no longer an empty field filled with soldiers. It was a web of obligations, and only after that web existed could the men inside it begin to behave as if the day's work might finally be ending. To understand what all this organization was actually protecting, move forward several centuries to Rome's northern frontier in Britain. Around AD 100, the soldiers at Vindolanda were not the Republican legionaries described by Polybius. Many served in auxiliary units, and Vindolanda was a frontier fort rather than an overnight marching camp. But the rubbish, writing tablets, shoes, cooking equipment, animal bones, storage buildings, and hearths preserved there exposed the human machinery that military diagrams usually hide. A Roman soldier still had to eat. Evidence from Vindolanda points to wheat and bread, meat, cheese, vegetables, berries, nuts, fats, beer, and wine. Soldiers could cook in barrack rooms equipped with hearths. Their equipment had to be practical because military life required movement. Some cooking vessels were designed so they could be attached to marching gear. Frying pans could have folding handles. A soldier on campaign might carry equipment from a forked pole called a furca, along with cooking gear, drink containers, and a supply of grain or other food. Even bread could be shaped by military necessity. Hard biscuit, known as bucellatum, contained less moisture than ordinary fresh bread and could survive longer on campaign. It was not glamorous food. That was precisely its value. A ration that survives the road is more useful than a feast that does not. And grain created its own war inside the camp. When archaeologists excavated granary areas at Vindolanda, they found the bones of thousands of mice beneath the floors. The animals had been living under the storage buildings, feeding on drain that slipped through gaps. It is a tiny archaeological detail, but it reveals a much larger problem. Feeding an army meant protecting food not only from enemy raiders, bad weather, and spoilage, but also from teeth small enough to disappear through a crack. If the food system failed, discipline could not replace calories. Then there was the soldier himself. Forget the polished marble image of the Roman warrior. Imagine wet clothing, smoke in the eyes, aching feet, a cooking vessel near the hearth, equipment piled beside the sleeping place, a body that had marched all day and still had to function tomorrow. At Vindolanda, one famous writing tablet mentions socks and underpants being sent to someone at the fort. Another surviving message was written by the cavalry officer Masculus to the prefect Flavius Cerealis. It dealt with military business. Then came a very human logistical problem. His men had no beer, and he wanted more scent. 2,000 years later, that detail can sound almost comic. For the soldiers involved, it was ordinary administration. The Roman army needed swords and shields. It also needed grain, clothing, cookware, leather, drink, fuel, shoes, animals, and countless other objects that kept human bodies functioning. Lose enough of those ordinary things and the discipline blocks on a military diagram begin to weaken. The contrast between ranks could also be sharp. Commanding officers at frontier bases such as Vindolanda could live in substantial residences with kitchens, servants, dining spaces, and comforts far beyond those of ordinary barrack rooms. Only a short distance away, ordinary soldiers might be preparing their own food over a hearth. Rank did not merely determine who gave orders, it helped determine who carried the pan. Rome did not conquer with statues. It conquered with tired men whose clothes became wet, whose food attracted mice, and whose beer could run out. That is what the clean lines on a military map conceal. Every rectangle marked as barracks contained bodies that needed calories. Every storehouse had to preserve something until tomorrow. Every fire consumed fuel. Every boot eventually wore down. The camp did not eliminate human weakness, it organized around it. And when the daylight disappeared, one human weakness became more dangerous than hunger, sore feet, wet clothing, or an empty beer barrel. Sleep. The camp that had spent the afternoon filling with noise now began changing function. Cooking fires still glowed among the tents. Horses shifted against their tethers. Men who had marched, dug, carried, cooked, and cleaned were finally preparing to close their eyes. But the army itself could not sleep. In Polybius's description of Republican camp procedure, night security began before darkness fully arrived. At sunset, selected men reported to their tribunes for a special responsibility. The tribune gave them the watchword. But the password was not merely whispered into an ear and trusted to memory. It was written on a small wooden tablet. The man carried that tablet back toward his quarters and passed it onward before witnesses. From unit to unit, the tablet traveled through the camp. Eventually, it had to return toward the tribunes before dark. If all the tablets returned, officers knew the watchword had passed through the chain. If one failed to appear, its markings could help identify where the transmission had stopped. This was information security conducted with wood, handwriting, witnesses, and tired soldiers. And it had a deadline: darkness. Once night settled across the camp, the perimeter became the critical line. Polybius describes light troops stationed along the defenses, and 10 men guarding each entrance. Other pickets protected important parts of the camp: officers, cavalry, and bodies of troops. Now picture the camp from outside. This is what an enemy might see: fires glowing behind the perimeter. Thousands of soldiers apparently settling down. Armor removed. Weapons no longer held in battle formation. Animals tied up. The camp quieter than it had been an hour earlier. The army looks tired because it is tired. To an enemy waiting in the darkness, this should be the moment when discipline dissolves into sleep. But between that enemy and the tents lay more than an earthwork. There was the wide open interval inside the defenses. There were familiar streets. There were guarded entrances. There were sentries positioned around the camp. And moving through this system were men whose job that night was to confirm that other men remained awake. The enemy saw an army resting. The system was still awake. Polybius says the duty of making the rounds belonged to selected cavalrymen. 4 men from a squadron could be chosen and assigned the different watches. Each received written instructions indicating which stations he had to inspect and when. At the beginning of a watch, a bugle sounded. Then, one patrolman began moving through the darkness. He did not merely pass the defenses and glance at the guards. He visited the posts listed in his orders. The perimeter, the entrances, infantry pickets, cavalry stations. He took companions with him as witnesses. At each post, one question mattered. Was the guard awake? If he was, the patrolman collected the small tablet issued to that station, the tessera, and continued. One post, then another, then another. The system created a physical trail showing that the watch had actually been checked. That mattered because darkness creates a particular kind of military danger. A rampart can be high, a ditch can be deep, a gate can be strong, but none of them can shout a warning. A human being has to see the threat, and human beings fall asleep. If a post went unguarded at the wrong moment, the ditch and rampart behind it could become meaningless. An attacker did not need every Roman soldier to fail. He needed one opening to remain unnoticed long enough. So the middle of the night became a repeated countdown. A bugle sounded, a patrol moved, a sentry waited, a tessera changed hands. Hundreds or thousands of men slept because a much smaller number of men at the edge of the camp did not. And before the system could consider the night successful, those small pieces of evidence had to survive until dawn, because at daybreak, the tablets were counted. If the numbers matched, the patrolmen could leave. If one was missing, the night was not over. The markings could reveal which station had failed to provide its tessera. The tribune could summon the officers responsible. The guards who had occupied the post could be brought forward. Then the patrolman faced them. Now the witnesses mattered. Polybius says that if a patrolman found a sentry asleep or absent, he was expected to call the men accompanying him to witness what he had seen. That protected the system in both directions. A guard could not simply deny abandoning his post, but a patrolman could not casually accuse him without evidence either. Someone had to account for the missing tablet. Behind this procedure was an intensely human scene. A soldier had marched during the day. He had helped establish camp. He may have carried equipment, eaten near a fire, and then been assigned a watch while hundreds of men around him finally slept. The camp becomes quiet. The temperature falls. Nothing happens. Then nothing happens again. His body begins demanding the one thing his duty forbids: sleep. Somewhere beyond the tents, the patrol is coming. If the sentry remains awake, he hands over his tessera, and the night continues. If the patrol arrives and finds an empty post, or a man sleeping beside it, the meaning of that tiny wooden object changes. It becomes evidence. In Polybius's description of Republican military discipline, the resulting investigation could end before a tribunal of officers. If the accused was found guilty of certain serious failures, he could face the punishment Polybius describes as fustuarium. The ritual began when the tribune touched the condemned man with a cudgel. Then other soldiers attacked him with clubs or stones. Polybius says the condemned man normally died inside the camp. Even if he escaped, he describes the social consequences as devastating. The punishment was terrifying because the vulnerability was terrifying. If one man abandoned his post, the price of his sleep might be paid by thousands of men behind him. That does not mean every sleepy Roman sentry in every period of Roman history was automatically beaten to death. Polybius was describing the disciplinary system of the Republican army known to him, and Roman practice changed across centuries. But the logic is unmistakable. Rome made a small duty terrifying because a small duty guarded an enormous weakness. A rampart does not know someone is approaching. A ditch cannot recognize a shadow. A gate cannot wake sleeping men. The sentry can. And responsibility did not necessarily stop with the lowest-ranking soldier. Polybius also describes severe consequences for officers who failed to issue the correct instructions for the patrol system. The chain itself had duties. That is what made the night watch more than a collection of frightened men trying not to fall asleep. It was an accountability system. Orders created posts. Posts produced tesserae. Patrols collected them. Witnesses verified failures. Tribunes examined the evidence. Punishment reminded everyone what those tiny tablets represented. Not bureaucracy, trust. Because once thousands of soldiers closed their eyes, the camp depended on a much smaller number agreeing not to close theirs. Eventually, darkness began to lift. The sentries who had survived the night could see the camp clearly again. But rest was not coming. The temporary town now had to disappear. At dawn, cavalry officers and centurions reported through the command structure for the day's orders. Then another routine began. Breaking camp. Polybius describes a sequence of signals. At the first, tents came down, with the tents of the consul and tribunes receiving precedence in the order of striking camp. At the second signal, the pack animals were loaded. At the third, the head of the marching column began to move. The transformation reversed itself. Tent ropes loosened. Pegs came out of the earth. Cooking equipment returned to marching loads. Baggage was secured. Animals were brought into order. The streets that had guided men through the night emptied. The military town became an army again, and that is the final reversal. The Roman camp was powerful precisely because Rome did not need to keep it. The ditch could be abandoned. The tent pegs could be pulled from the ground. The cooking fires could collapse into ash. What mattered was that the relationships survived. Who reported to whom? Where baggage belonged. When tents came down, when animals were loaded, which formation moved next? How an empty field could become another organized camp when the next day's march ended. Polybius understood the trade-off. The Romans accepted the fatigue of defensive work in exchange for a form of camp whose logic was familiar to the army. That did not make Roman forces invincible. Roman armies could still be surprised, defeated, starved, trapped, and destroyed. But the system removed one dangerous uncertainty from campaign life. Every evening did not have to begin from zero. For the ordinary soldier, that advantage came at a price measured in sore hands, lost sleep, cooking smoke, baggage, mud, guard duty, and orders to keep working when the body wanted to stop. That is what life inside a Roman camp really looked like. Not marble heroes waiting motionless for the next battle. Not endless ranks of perfect legionaries. It was a military town built by tired human beings, kept functioning through food, labor, streets, animals, passwords, patrols, and discipline, then dismantled when the next march began. By morning, little might remain but disturbed earth, cooling ashes, holes where stakes had stood, and a road filling with men moving toward another horizon. Rome could leave the camp behind, because the most important part of it marched away inside the army. Subscribe for more hidden military systems and forgotten details that changed the way wars were fought.